In the gray mist of dawn, when the world seemed suspended between night and day, Agnes pulled her tattered woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the cold, fetid water of Blackmire Marsh. The mud sucked at her bare feet with each labored step, releasing bubbles of marsh gas that carried the stench of decay and death. She had been walking this same treacherous path for 10 years now, since her husband died of the sweating sickness and left her with 3 children to feed and no other means of survival. The bite marks on her legs, some fresh and weeping, others old and scarred white, told the story of her desperation better than any words ever could. Agnes was a leech collector, one of the wretched souls who risked life and limb daily to harvest the blood-sucking parasites that medieval physicians demanded in ever-growing numbers for their bloodletting treatments. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. In a world where medicine was more superstition than science, where the balance of bodily humors was considered the foundation of health, Leah's had become as precious as gold to the medical practitioners of the realm. And where there was demand, there were always those desperate enough to supply it, no matter the cost to their own bodies and souls. The morning air hung thick with fog and the oppressive weight of another day's torment. Agnes could hear the distant splashing of other collectors scattered throughout the vast marshland. Fellow souls condemned to this living hell by circumstances beyond their control. There was old Henrik, the former soldier, whose missing leg had made him unemployable, except for this cursed profession. There was young Mary, barely 16, whose widowed mother had died of consumption, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that offered few options for unmarried women. And there was Silent Tom, who had lost his tongue in a tavern brawl years ago and found that his disability made him unsuitable for any work except allowing parasites to feast upon his blood. Each of them had their own story of how they had fallen into this nightmare, but all their tales shared common threads: poverty, desperation, and the cruel reality that in medieval society there were always occupations so dangerous and degrading that only the utterly hopeless would accept them. The leech collectors occupied the very bottom rung of an already harsh social hierarchy, viewed with a mixture of revulsion and pity by those fortunate enough to earn their bread through less gruesome means. The path that led Agnes to Blackmire Marsh had begun innocently enough, woven from the same threads of hardship and limited opportunity that defined life for the vast majority of medieval people. Born in the year of our Lord, 1347, during the height of the Black Death that would claim nearly half of Europe's population, Agnes entered a world already reeling from catastrophe and social upheaval. Her parents, William and Margot, were villains bound to Lord Aldrich's manor in the countryside north of London, their lives governed by feudal obligations that tied them to the land, as surely as chains bound prisoners to dungeon walls. The cottage where Agnes spent her childhood was typical of peasant dwellings throughout medieval England. A single room shared by the entire family, with walls of wattle and daub that provided little protection against wind or rain. The floor was bare earth, packed hard by generations of feet, but still turning to mud whenever the thatched roof leaked during heavy storms. A central hearth provided warmth and light, though fuel was always scarce, and the family often huddled together under thin blankets during the long winter months. Their daily existence revolved around survival and the grinding rhythm of agricultural labor. William worked Lord Aldrich's domain land 3 days per week, as required by his feudal obligations, and spent the remaining time tending the small plot that provided food for his family. The work was backbreaking, plowing fields with oxen when they were available, by hand when they were not, harvesting grain with crude sickles that left his hands permanently scarred, and maintaining the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that sustained medieval agricultural life. Margot's days were equally demanding, filled with the countless tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. She baked bread from whatever grain they could afford, brewed weak ale that was safer to drink than the contaminated well water, spun thread from wool when they could obtain it, and maintained the small vegetable garden that provided much of their nutrition. During harvest season, she worked alongside William in the fields, her hands as calloused and scarred as any man's from years of handling rough tools and coarse materials. Agnes's childhood was shaped by constant hunger and the ever-present threat of starvation that haunted medieval peasant families. Their diet consisted primarily of dark bread made from barley or oats. Wheat was a luxury reserved for their social betters, and pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever vegetables, grains, and occasional scraps of meat they could obtain. Meat appeared on their table only during religious festivals, or when an animal died of disease, and had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled completely. The Black Death had swept through their region when Agnes was barely 3 years old, killing Lord Aldrich himself, along with nearly half the population of the manor. The social upheaval that followed created opportunities for some peasants to improve their circumstances, as the dramatic reduction in population made labor scarce and valuable. But for Agnes's family, the plague years brought only additional hardship, as surviving nobles increased their demands on the remaining peasants to compensate for their reduced revenues. Agnes learned to read the signs of seasonal hardship, as other children learned to read letters. The gradual thinning of the pottage, as winter stores ran low, the hollow look that appeared in her parents' eyes when they calculated whether their remaining grain would last until the next harvest, the careful rationing that meant each family member received just enough food to maintain life, but never enough to satisfy hunger. She understood from an early age that survival was never guaranteed, and that starvation was always just one bad harvest, away from claiming her family as it had claimed so many others. Education was an impossible luxury for children of Agnes's social class. While the sons of nobles learned to read Latin and studied the classical texts that formed the foundation of medieval scholarship, peasant children, like Agnes, learned only the practical skills necessary for survival in an agricultural society. She helped her mother with spinning and weaving, learned to identify edible plants and herbs, and mastered the countless small tasks that kept a medieval household functioning despite the constant pressure of poverty and want. The Catholic Church provided the only respite from the grinding hardship of daily life, offering a promise of better things in the afterlife for those who endured their earthly suffering with proper Christian resignation. Agnes learned the basic prayers and attended Mass when she could, finding comfort in the ritualized promise that God would ultimately reward the faithful and punish the wicked. But as she grew older, she began to wonder why God's justice seemed so slow in arriving, and why the wicked appeared to prosper while the faithful suffered in poverty and disease. When Agnes reached marriageable age at 16, her parents arranged her betrothal to Walter, a freeman carpenter whose skills provided him with slightly better prospects than the typical peasant. Freeman status meant Walter was not bound to any particular lord's land and could travel to seek work wherever his carpentry skills were needed. This mobility represented a significant advantage in a society where most people were tied to the land of their birth and had no legal right to leave their lord's domain. The wedding ceremony was a simple affair, conducted in the village church, with only immediate family members present, and followed by a modest feast that represented a significant expenditure for both families involved. Agnes wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that she had gathered herself from the meadows around the village. The marriage contract, negotiated between her father and Walter, included a small dowry of household goods and a few silver coins that represented years of careful saving. Walter's carpentry skills allowed them to rent a slightly larger cottage on the outskirts of the village, with 2 rooms instead of 1, and a small plot of land where Agnes could maintain a vegetable garden. For the first time in her life, Agnes experienced something approaching security, with regular meals and a roof that didn't leak during every rainstorm. Walter's work provided them with enough income to purchase occasional luxuries: a piece of salt pork for Sunday dinner, wool for warm winter clothing, even a few silver coins saved for emergencies. The early years of their marriage were among the happiest of Agnes's life. She bore Walter 3 healthy children, 2 sons named Thomas and Robert, and a daughter named Margaret. And for a time it seemed as though they might escape the grinding poverty that claimed so many of their social class. Walter's reputation as a skilled craftsman grew, and he began receiving commissions from prosperous merchants and even minor nobles who were willing to pay premium prices for quality work. Agnes threw herself into the role of wife and mother with the same determination that had helped her survive her childhood. She maintained their cottage with meticulous care, kept their small garden productive through careful tending and innovative techniques she learned from other women in the village, and managed their modest finances with the skill of a merchant banker. She took pride in the fact that her children never went to bed hungry, that their clothes were clean and mended, and that their home provided a refuge from the hardships that surrounded them. But medieval life had a cruel way of destroying even the most modest happiness, with sudden, devastating efficiency. The sweating sickness that appeared in their region during the summer of Agnes's 30th year moved through the population with the speed and lethality of wildfire, killing healthy adults within days of their first symptoms. The disease showed no respect for social class or virtue, claiming nobles and peasants alike. But it seemed particularly drawn to hard-working men in the prime of their lives. Walter's illness began on a Tuesday morning, with complaints of fever and aching joints that he dismissed as the natural result of his physical labor. By Wednesday evening, he was delirious with fever, his body racked with violent shaking that no amount of blankets could control. Thursday brought vomiting and a rash that covered his body with red welts, and by Friday dawn, he was barely conscious. Agnes spent those 3 days nursing him with every remedy she knew, cooling his fever with wet cloths, forcing him to drink water and weak broth, praying to every saint she could remember from her childhood. But medieval medicine had no effective treatments for the sweating sickness, and Walter died on Friday evening, just as the church bells were ringing vespers. His final breath came as a relief after days of watching him suffer. But his death left Agnes facing a catastrophe that would define the remainder of her life. Without Walter's income, she had no means of paying rent on their cottage, no way to purchase food for her children, and no marketable skills that could provide the income necessary for survival. Walter's death transformed Agnes from a respectable carpenter's wife into one of the desperate poor whose existence remained precarious in the best of times and became impossible during any crisis. The medieval economy offered precious few opportunities for widows, especially those with dependent children and no family connections to provide support. Agnes discovered that her husband's death had effectively stripped her of all social status and economic security, leaving her and her children vulnerable to every predatory practice that medieval society employed against the powerless. The landlord, who owned their cottage, showed the typical mercy that medieval property owners extended toward indigent tenants. He gave Agnes exactly 1 week to produce the rent money she owed or vacate the premises, and made it clear that her status as a recent widow with 3 young children would not influence his decision in any way. When Agnes explained that she needed time to find work and establish an income, he suggested several occupations that were available to desperate women, none of which offered wages sufficient to maintain a household or working conditions that would allow her to care for her children. Agnes spent that week in increasingly frantic attempts to find some means of survival that would allow her to keep her family together. She approached every merchant and craftsman in the village, offering to work for wages that would have been considered insulting under normal circumstances. She visited the church to plead for charity, only to discover that the parish funds were already stretched thin by the number of families facing similar crises. She even swallowed her pride and approached Lord Aldrich Stewart to beg for work in the manor house kitchens, despite knowing that such positions typically required sexual favors in addition to menial labor. But the harsh reality was that medieval society had no safety net for people in Agnes's situation. The feudal system that governed rural life was designed to maintain stability through rigid social hierarchies, not to provide assistance for those who fell through the cracks of the established order. Charitable institutions existed, but were overwhelmed by the number of people seeking help, and their resources were typically reserved for those with connections to wealthy patrons or religious authorities. Agnes's introduction to the world of leech collecting came through old Marta, a woman whose appearance immediately marked her as someone who had endured unimaginable hardship in pursuit of survival. Marta was perhaps 50 years old, though her weathered face and prematurely white hair made her look decades older. Her body bore the unmistakable signs of her profession: legs covered in scars from ankle to thigh, where countless leeches had fed over the years, a permanent pallor that came from chronic blood loss, and the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had seen too much suffering to remain fully human. "It's honest work," Marta told Agnes during their first meeting, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. "The physicians always need leeches, and they'll pay fair coin for good specimens. 3 pence per dozen for the best ones, sometimes more during peak bleeding season." 3 pence per dozen. Agnes calculated quickly in her head, trying to determine whether such wages could possibly sustain her family. At that rate, she would need to collect at least 200 leeches just to buy enough bread to feed her children for a week. And that assumed she could find buyers for all her leeches, that none died during transport, that the physicians didn't demand lower prices due to oversupply, and that she remained healthy enough to work consistently. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. Agnes's children needed approximately 2 pounds of bread per day to survive, which cost about 6 pence at current market prices. Add to that the cost of fuel for cooking and heating, occasional pieces of cheese or salt pork to prevent malnutrition, and the rent for whatever hovel she could afford, and her family's survival required an income of at least 4 shillings per week. At 3 pence per dozen leeches, that meant collecting 16 dozen leeches every week, over 1,900 leeches per week, nearly 300 leeches every single day, including Sundays. But what choice did she have? Winter was approaching with the inevitability of death itself. Her children were already showing the early signs of malnutrition that she remembered from her own childhood, and every other option seemed either impossible or even more degrading than allowing parasites to feed on her blood. Agnes had heard stories about women who turned to prostitution to feed their families, only to die of disease or violence within months. She had seen desperate mothers abandon their children at monastery doors, hoping that religious charity would provide the care they themselves could not afford. She had witnessed families simply disappear during hard times, walking away from their homes in search of opportunities that existed mainly in their desperate imaginations. Marta led Agnes to the outskirts of Blackmire Marsh on a cold October morning that would remain burned in Agnes's memory for the rest of her shortened life. The journey to the marsh took them through nearly 2 miles of increasingly desolate countryside, past abandoned farmsteads where entire families had perished during the recent plague years, and through patches of woodland that had reverted to wilderness as the human population declined. The marsh itself stretched out before them, like a vision designed by demons to torment the living. Thousands of acres of standing water, broken by islands of higher ground, where dead and dying trees created a skeletal forest against the gray sky. The water was black with dissolved organic matter from decades of plant decay, and the surface was broken by the occasional emergence of bog holes that could swallow a full-grown person without leaving a trace. A thick canopy of mist hung over the entire area, creating an atmosphere that seemed to muffle both sound and light, while intensifying the oppressive sense of dread that emanated from the stagnant waters. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and something else that Agnes couldn't identify but which made her stomach churn with instinctive revulsion. The air itself felt thick and poisonous, heavy with gases released by decomposing organic matter and tainted with the sweet, sick scent of things long dead. Agnes found herself fighting the urge to vomit as they approached the water's edge, her body's natural defenses warning her that this place was fundamentally hostile to human life. "The leeches like the shallow areas," Marta explained, pointing to sections of the marsh where the water was only knee-deep and partially concealed by beds of reeds and aquatic grasses. "They hide in the vegetation during the day, but if you disturb the water, they'll come out to investigate. That's when they'll attach to your legs." Marta demonstrated the technique that Agnes would soon know by heart, a ritual that combined elements of fishing, self-mutilation, and endurance testing into a practice that challenged every human instinct for self-preservation. She waded into the murky water with her legs and feet completely bare, carrying a stout willow branch that she used to thrash the water around the submerged vegetation. The disturbance created clouds of sediment that turned the already dark water completely opaque and released bubbles of marsh gas that carried an even stronger version of the overwhelming smell. Within minutes, dark shapes began moving through the water toward Marta's legs, attracted by the disturbance and the warmth of human blood. Agnes watched in horrified fascination as the first leech attached itself to the old woman's calf, its segmented body immediately beginning to expand as it started feeding. The sight was deeply disturbing on a visceral level. Watching another human being deliberately allow parasites to feed on her blood violated every instinct that had kept the human species alive for thousands of years. "Don't move once they start attaching," Marta instructed, her voice unnaturally calm for someone being consumed alive by blood-sucking parasites. "Let them feed for as long as they want, usually about 20 minutes. If you try to pull them off too soon, they'll leave their teeth in your skin and cause infection. Wait until they drop off on their own, fat and satisfied." More leeches found Marta as she stood motionless in the fetid water. They seemed to communicate with each other somehow, or perhaps they were simply drawn by the scent of fresh blood and the chemical signals released by their feeding companions. Within 10 minutes, Marta's legs were covered with feeding leeches, each one growing visibly larger as it consumed her life force drop by drop. The old woman stood like a statue in the black water, her face showing no emotion as dozens of creatures drained her blood with methodical efficiency. Agnes found herself mesmerized by the rhythm of the feeding process. She could see the leeches pulsing in time with Marta's heartbeat as they drew blood from her vessels, could watch them growing fatter and more sluggish as they consumed their fill. It was like witnessing some ancient ritual sacrifice, a deliberate offering of human blood to creatures that existed solely to consume the life force of higher animals. The bleeding doesn't stop when they detach, Marta continued, maintaining her unnaturally calm tone, despite the fact that dozens of parasites were literally consuming her blood. The wounds will bleed for hours, sometimes all day. That's the hardest part to get used to. You'll feel weak, dizzy. Sometimes you'll faint right here in the marsh. I've seen collectors drown because they passed out from blood loss and fell face first into the water. The casual way that Marta discussed the prospect of drowning while unconscious from blood loss drove home the truly desperate nature of the profession Agnes was considering. This wasn't simply dangerous work. It was a form of slow suicide, a daily gamble with death that offered meager financial rewards in exchange for the systematic destruction of one's health and life expectancy. When the leeches finally detached, gorged with blood and sluggish from their feast, Marta collected them carefully in a canvas bag that hung from her shoulder. Each leech was now 5 times its original size, transformed from a thin, dark worm into a bloated, glistening creature that pulsed with stolen blood. The sight was deeply repulsive. These creatures were literally carrying parts of Marta's life within their bodies, proof of the transaction that had just taken place between human desperation and parasitic opportunism. The wounds left behind on Marta's legs continued to weep steadily, creating rivulets of red that mixed with the marsh water and attracted more leeches to the area. Agnes could see that some of the wounds were bleeding more heavily than others, and several were positioned in locations that would make walking difficult and painful. The old woman's legs looked like they had been attacked by some savage animal, covered in bleeding puncture wounds that would leave permanent scars, even if they healed without infection. "A good day's work is 500 leeches," Marta said, examining the contents of her bag with the practiced eye of someone who had made this calculation thousands of times. "That's about 40 dozen, maybe 50 if you're lucky. Pays enough to keep body and soul together, assuming the soul is willing to endure what the body must suffer." Agnes looked at the old woman's scarred and bleeding legs, at her hollow cheeks and trembling hands, and understood with perfect clarity that she was looking at her own future. The profession of leech collecting didn't offer a path to prosperity or even modest comfort. It was a slow death sentence that paid just enough to postpone starvation while systematically destroying every aspect of one's health and humanity. But her children needed food, and winter was coming. And sometimes the only choice available was between certain death and the possibility of a slow, agonizing decline that might last long enough to keep one's loved ones alive a little longer. Agnes's first day as a leech collector began in the pre-dawn darkness of a November morning, so cold that her breath formed clouds of vapor that seemed to freeze in the air before dissipating. The walk from her new shelter, a crude lean-to she had constructed against the wall of an abandoned mill using salvaged wood and stolen thatch, took her through nearly a mile of treacherous terrain where one wrong step could plunge her into a bog hole deep enough to swallow a full-grown person without leaving a trace. She had spent the night in fitful sleep, tormented by dreams of her children crying with hunger and nightmares of herself drowning in black water while leeches covered her body like a living shroud of death. The thin wool blanket that served as her only protection against the cold provided little warmth, and she had awakened several times during the night with her teeth chattering and her body shaking uncontrollably from the combination of cold and terror. When she finally gave up on sleep and prepared for her first venture into the marsh, her hands shook so violently she could barely tie the cord that held her canvas collection bag to her shoulder. The bag itself was a pathetic thing, a piece of old sailcloth that Marta had given her, stained with blood and other fluids from years of use, and sporting several holes that she had attempted to mend with scraps of thread. It smelled of death and decay, a permanent reminder of the countless leeches that had died within its confines during transport. To buyers who viewed them as nothing more than medical commodities, the technique Marta had demonstrated looked simple enough in concept, but the reality proved far more complex and horrifying than Agnes had imagined. Standing waist-deep in water that felt like liquid ice, she began the ritual that would define the remainder of her life and ultimately lead to her death. She used a peeled willow wand to thrash the water around submerged logs and reed beds, disturbing the sediment and creating the disturbance that would attract the leeches from their hiding places in the mud and vegetation. The physical sensation of standing in the marsh water was immediately overwhelming. The cold penetrated her body within seconds, numbing her legs and feet until she could barely feel them touching the bottom. The water itself had an oily, viscous quality that made every movement feel labored and unnatural, as if she were wading through some thick fluid designed to impede human motion. The smell was even worse when she was immersed in the source, a combination of rotting vegetation, anaerobic decay, and chemical compounds that her body instinctively recognized as toxic and dangerous. The first leech to attach itself to her leg felt like a small, cold pressure against her skin, followed by a sharp pinprick sensation as the creature bit through her flesh and began to feed. Agnes looked down through the black water and saw the dark, segmented creature exploring her calf with what seemed like deliberate intent before it found a spot to its liking and settled in to begin consuming her blood. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not painful exactly, but deeply unsettling, as if her very life force was being drawn out through her skin by some malevolent intelligence. Within minutes, more leeches had found her, drawn by chemical signals she couldn't detect, but which announced her presence to every blood-seeking creature in the immediate area. They seemed to communicate with each other somehow, because they appeared to coordinate their attacks to maximize their collective feeding efficiency. Agnes forced herself to remain motionless as the creatures attached themselves to her legs, ankles, and feet, each one growing visibly larger as it fed on blood that she could ill afford to lose. The feeding process was almost hypnotic in its rhythm and intensity. Agnes could feel her pulse quickening as her body tried to compensate for the blood loss, could see the leeches pulsing in time with her heartbeat as they consumed her life essence with methodical efficiency. Each creature seemed to have its own feeding pattern. Some fed quickly and aggressively. Others took their time and seemed to savor the experience. She found herself counting her heartbeats and trying to estimate how much blood each leech was consuming, a calculation that filled her with growing horror as she realized the sheer volume of her life force that was being transferred into the bodies of these parasites. The hardest part was the waiting. 20 minutes of standing perfectly still in freezing water, while parasites fed on your blood, felt like an eternity of purposeful suffering. Agnes tried to distract herself by counting the leeches attached to her legs, by reciting prayers she had learned as a child, by thinking about her children and the food she would be able to buy with the money from this day's harvest. But always, her attention returned to the sensation of being consumed alive, of feeling her strength drain away drop by drop, while she remained powerless to stop the process. The cold water made the ordeal even more torturous than it would have been under better conditions. Her legs became numb within minutes of entering the marsh, but she could still feel the leeches feeding, a strange, drawing sensation that seemed to come from deep within her body as the creatures used their powerful sucking mechanism to extract blood from her vessels. The combination of cold and blood loss created a unique form of suffering that challenged her sanity as much as her physical endurance. When the leeches finally detached, bloated and satisfied with their feast, Agnes collected them carefully in her canvas bag, trying not to think about the fact that these creatures were literally carrying parts of her life within their distended bodies. Each leech was now a fat, glistening slug that pulsed with her own blood, proof of the transaction that had just taken place between human desperation and parasitic opportunism. She tried not to look too closely at the creatures as she placed them in her bag, but she couldn't avoid noticing how much larger they had become, or how much more sluggish their movements were, now that they were gorged with her blood. But the ordeal was far from over when the leeches finished feeding. As Marta had warned, the wounds left by the creatures continued to bleed profusely due to the powerful anticoagulants that leeches injected while feeding. These chemicals prevented the blood from clotting naturally, ensuring that the wounds would continue to weep for hours after the leeches detached. Agnes's legs were soon covered in streams of blood that mixed with the marsh water and created red clouds that attracted even more leeches to the area. The blood loss left her feeling weak and dizzy within the first hour of collecting. Several times during that first day, she had to grab onto a half-submerged tree branch to keep from falling face first into the water, her vision blurring, and her sense of balance compromised by the combination of cold exposure and blood loss. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, making it difficult to handle the leeches or maintain her grip on her collection tools. She felt as though she were viewing the world through a thick fog, with sounds seeming to come from great distances and colors appearing muted and strange. By the time she finally dragged herself out of the marsh that evening, Agnes was so weak she could barely stand. Her legs continued to bleed from dozens of wounds, staining her ragged skirt and leaving a trail of red droplets as she stumbled home through the gathering darkness. She had collected nearly 300 leeches during her first day, enough to earn almost 2 shillings when she sold them to the physicians in the nearby town, more money than she had seen in months. But as she collapsed in her crude shelter and tried to stanch the bleeding from her legs with scraps of cloth, Agnes began to understand the true cost of her new profession. The money she had earned represented not just hours of labor, but literal pieces of her life. Blood that could never be replaced, and strength that would never fully return. She was trading her physical essence for the coins that would keep her children alive another day, and the mathematics of that exchange were as brutal as they were unsustainable. She had no way of knowing that most leech collectors died within 5 years of entering the profession, their bodies unable to sustain the constant blood loss and exposure to infection. She didn't understand that her decision to become a leech collector had essentially set a timer on her remaining life, that every day she worked in the marsh brought her closer to an early grave. All she knew was that she had earned enough money to buy bread for her children, and that tomorrow she would have to return to the marsh and do it all over again. Winter in the marsh was a special kind of torment that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and challenged every survival instinct that evolution had developed over millions of years. The leeches became sluggish in cold weather, retreating to deeper waters and hiding in the mud where they were almost impossible to find without taking extraordinary risks. This seasonal behavior meant that Agnes had to work even harder to collect the same number of creatures. often standing chest deep in water, so cold it caused muscle cramps and hypothermia, while searching for leeches that might not even be present in collectible numbers. The marsh in winter was a landscape that seemed designed by malevolent forces to torture human beings through slow, methodical destruction of their physical and mental health. Ice formed around the edges of the standing water during the coldest periods, creating sharp barriers that could slice open unwary flesh with surgical precision. The dead trees that jutted from the water's surface became coated with frost that made them slippery and treacherous to grab for support, turning potential lifelines into deadly traps that could send a weakened collector plummeting face first into the freezing water. The fog that perpetually shrouded the area became so thick during winter months that Agnes often lost all sense of direction, stumbling through the freezing water for hours without being able to find her way back to solid ground. The disorientation was complete and terrifying. She would wade through the black water in what she thought was a straight line toward shore, only to find herself in deeper water with no landmarks visible in any direction. Several times during her first winter, she spent entire days wandering through the marsh without collecting a single leech, simply trying to find her way back to dry land before hypothermia or exhaustion killed her. But perhaps worst of all was the complete isolation that winter brought to her already solitary profession. During the warmer months, Agnes could at least see other collectors scattered throughout the vast marsh, could hear their occasional calls or curses echoing across the water, like the voices of fellow souls trapped in some aquatic version of hell. In winter, she was utterly alone in a world that seemed designed to kill her through slow, methodical torture, with no human contact except for the brief encounters she had with buyers when she sold her meager harvest. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of her own labored breathing, the gentle lapping of water against her legs as she moved through the marsh, and the occasional splash of some unseen creature moving through the dark water. The quiet was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on her consciousness and making every sound she made seem unnaturally loud and intrusive. She found herself whispering prayers or talking to herself just to break the oppressive silence. But even her own voice sounded strange and distorted in the thick, mist-laden air. The cold water caused agonizing muscle cramps that could strike without warning, doubling Agnes over in pain and threatening to dump her face first into the water where she could drown within minutes. These cramps were particularly dangerous because they often affected her legs while she was standing in deep water, leaving her unable to maintain her balance or move towards safety until the spasm passed. She learned to recognize the early warning signs: a slight twitching in her calf muscles, a sensation of tightness in her thighs, and to immediately move toward shallower water when she felt them beginning. Her feet and hands became so numb from prolonged exposure to the cold water that she often couldn't tell whether she was standing on solid ground or about to step into a deep hole that could swallow her completely. Frostbite claimed several of her toes during her second winter as a collector, leaving her with blackened, dead tissue that eventually fell off and left her with a permanent limp that made walking through the uneven marsh terrain even more treacherous and exhausting. The frostbite began as a tingling sensation in her toes that she initially dismissed as a normal response to cold exposure. But as the winter progressed, the tingling became numbness, then pain, then a complete loss of sensation that should have warned her of serious tissue damage. By the time she realized what was happening, several toes on both feet had turned black with necrosis, the flesh literally dying from lack of circulation while she continued to work in the freezing water. She treated the frostbite with the same folk remedies she used for everything else: warming the affected areas gradually, applying poultices made from whatever medicinal plants she could find, and wrapping the damaged toes in scraps of cloth to protect them from further injury. But medieval medicine had no effective treatments for severe frostbite, and Agnes could only watch helplessly as pieces of her body died and fell away, leaving behind wounds that took months to heal and permanent disabilities that would affect her for the rest of her life. The leeches themselves seemed to sense her desperation and weakness during the winter months, becoming more aggressive in their feeding behavior and more difficult to collect efficiently. During the warmer months, they would attach quickly and feed with predictable patterns before detaching on their own. But in winter, they became sluggish and unpredictable, sometimes taking hours to detach and leaving wounds that were more ragged and prone to infection than the relatively clean punctures they made during their peak feeding season. Agnes learned to recognize the signs of infected leech bites, the red streaking that spread up her legs from the wound sites like fingers of corruption reaching toward her heart, the fever that made her delirious and unable to distinguish between reality and hallucination, the pus that oozed from wounds that refused to heal despite her best efforts at treatment. These infections were particularly dangerous during winter because her body's natural immune responses were compromised by cold exposure, malnutrition, and the constant stress of blood loss. She treated these infections as best she could, with folk remedies passed down through generations of desperate people who had learned to survive without access to professional medical care. She pressed spider webs against open wounds to stop bleeding, having learned that the silk contained natural antibacterial compounds. She chewed willow bark for fever, enduring the bitter taste because she knew it provided some relief from the worst symptoms. She applied poultices made from bread mold to fight corruption, using the same principle that would later be refined into modern antibiotic treatments. Sometimes these treatments helped, providing just enough improvement to allow her body's natural healing processes to gain the upper hand over infection. More often, they merely delayed the inevitable progression of corruption towards sepsis and death, buying her a few extra days or weeks of life, while the infection gradually overwhelmed her compromised immune system. She learned to read the signs that indicated whether an infection would respond to treatment or prove fatal: the color and smell of the discharge, the pattern of red streaking, the severity of the fever, and its response to her remedies. During her third winter in the marsh, Agnes witnessed the death of young Mary, the 16-year-old girl who had started collecting leeches around the same time as Agnes herself. Mary had developed a serious infection in a cluster of leech bites on her left leg, and the red streaking had spread all the way to her groin before she finally collapsed, face first in the marsh water, during what would prove to be her final collecting session. Agnes found Mary's body 3 days later, bloated and discolored from its time in the contaminated marsh water, with leeches covering every exposed inch of flesh, like some hideous form of living decay. The sight was deeply disturbing even for someone who had become accustomed to the daily horrors of marsh life. Mary's face was unrecognizable, swollen and distorted by decomposition, and partially consumed by the creatures that had covered her body after death. The other collectors helped Agnes drag Mary's corpse to solid ground, but none of them could afford the cost of a proper burial or the time away from collecting that would be required to transport the body to consecrated ground. They wrapped the body in Agnes's spare cloak, the only burial shroud they could afford, and buried it in a shallow grave beside the marsh, marking the spot with a crude wooden cross that would rot away within a few years and leave no permanent record of Mary's existence or suffering. It was a fate that awaited all of them eventually, and they all knew it with the certainty that comes from witnessing the deaths of too many colleagues. But knowledge of their inevitable doom did nothing to provide them with alternatives to their cursed profession, and the grim mathematics of survival meant that even witnessing Mary's death didn't provide sufficient motivation to abandon the work that was slowly killing them all. Agnes returned to the marsh the day after Mary's burial, standing in the same contaminated water that had claimed the girl's life, and allowing leeches to feed on her blood as if nothing had changed. Even within the wretched world of leech collecting, there existed a complex social hierarchy based on experience, skill, and the gradual erosion of human dignity that came with years of allowing parasites to feed on one's blood. This hierarchy provided structure and meaning to lives that had been stripped of almost everything else, creating a perverse form of social organization among people who had been abandoned by conventional society and left to create their own codes of conduct and survival. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the newcomers, desperate souls like Agnes had once been, who still retained some vestige of hope that they might survive the profession long enough to find something better, or at least accumulate enough savings to provide for their family's future needs. These beginners were easy to identify by their mistakes and their naivety about the realities of marsh life. They pulled leeches off too soon, causing infected wounds and losing potential income. They worked in the deepest, most dangerous parts of the marsh, where drowning was a constant threat, but where they mistakenly believed the largest leeches could be found. They hadn't yet learned to recognize the subtle signs that separated a profitable collecting day from a waste of blood and suffering. The newcomers also retained emotional responses that the veterans had learned to suppress or abandon entirely. They still felt revulsion at the sight of leeches feeding on their blood, still experienced fear when working alone in dangerous areas of the marsh, and still maintained hope that their situation might improve with time and effort. These emotions were viewed by the veteran collectors as dangerous luxuries that interfered with the cold calculation required for survival in such a hostile environment. Above the newcomers were the experienced collectors, people who had survived their first few years and developed the hard-won knowledge that meant the difference between life and death in the marsh. These veterans knew which areas produced the best leeches during different seasons, which weather conditions made for optimal collecting, and how to read the subtle signs in their own bodies that warned of impending infection or dangerous blood loss. They had learned to suppress their natural revulsion at their work and to treat leech collection as a technical skill rather than an ongoing form of self-mutilation. The experienced collectors formed loose alliances with each other, sharing information about productive collecting spots and helping newcomers avoid the most obvious fatal mistakes. But these relationships were always tempered by competition for limited resources, and the knowledge that helping another collector survive might mean less food for one's own family. They developed their own informal code of conduct that governed interactions between collectors. Never work another person's proven spot without permission. Share information about dangerous areas where collectors had drowned or been killed by snakes. Help newcomers avoid fatal mistakes. But don't waste time trying to save those who were clearly doomed. At the apex of this grim hierarchy were the marshmasters, collectors who had somehow survived for a decade or more and had developed an almost supernatural understanding of leech behavior, marsh ecology, and the techniques required for maximum efficiency in harvesting blood-sucking parasites. These legendary figures were rare because most collectors died within 5 years of entering the profession, making survival beyond a decade a rarity, remarkable achievement that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Old Henrik was one of these legendary figures, a former soldier who had lost his left leg below the knee in some long-forgotten battle and found that his disability made him perfectly suited for a profession that required standing motionless in water for hours at a time while parasites fed on human blood. Henrik's missing limb actually provided him with certain advantages in the marsh. He needed to provide less surface area for leech attachment, which meant he lost less blood during each collecting session and could work longer hours without becoming dangerously weakened. Henrik had been collecting leeches for 15 years when Agnes first met him, and his body showed every day of that ordeal in ways that served as a preview of her own eventual fate. His remaining leg was covered in scars from thousands of leech bites, creating a pattern that looked like some bizarre form of ritual scarification performed by a culture that worshipped blood-sucking parasites. The scars formed layers upon layers, with newer wounds healing over older ones in an ever-changing map of suffering that chronicled his years in the marsh. His face had the distinctive pallor that came from chronic blood loss, a grayish, waxy complexion that made him look like a corpse that had somehow retained the ability to walk and speak. His hands shook constantly from the nervous disorders that plagued long-term collectors, a tremor that never stopped and gradually worsened over the years until simple tasks like eating or drinking became exercises in concentration and will. His cough was wet and rattling, suggesting serious lung damage from breathing marsh vapors for so many years. But despite his obvious physical deterioration, Henrik possessed knowledge that could mean the difference between a profitable day and a fatal one, and he was willing to share that knowledge with collectors who showed the proper respect and demonstrated genuine commitment to learning the craft. He had developed an encyclopedic understanding of leech behavior that went far beyond simple collection techniques, incorporating weather patterns, seasonal migrations, breeding cycles, and the subtle environmental cues that indicated where the best specimens could be found. The leeches follow patterns, Henrik explained to Agnes during her 4th year in the marsh, his voice barely more than a whisper, due to the lung damage that made speaking difficult. They migrate through different areas depending on the season, the weather, the phase of the moon, even the time of day. Learn to read those patterns, and you can predict where the best collecting will be from week to week. Henrik taught Agnes to recognize the subtle differences between medicinal leeches and the less valuable species that shared the same habitat, a skill that required years of experience to master completely. The medicinal leeches, Hirudo medicinalis, had distinctive markings and feeding behavior that commanded premium prices from physicians who believed they were more effective for bloodletting treatments. Horse leeches, Hirudo vulgaris, were larger and more aggressive, but considered less suitable for medical purposes by most practitioners. Learning to distinguish between species while they were attached to your legs and feeding on your blood required a level of expertise that took years to develop and could only be acquired through direct, painful experience. Agnes had to learn to recognize the different species by the sensation of their bite, the pattern of their feeding behavior, and the appearance of the wounds they left behind. The knowledge was literally written in her flesh through thousands of leech bites that served as a painful education in the taxonomy of blood-sucking parasites. More importantly, Henrik taught Agnes the unspoken rules that governed interactions between collectors and provided the social structure that made survival possible in such a hostile environment. These rules were never written down or formally articulated, but they were understood by every collector who wanted to survive more than a few months in the profession. Never work another collector's proven spot without explicit permission, because territorial disputes could quickly escalate to violence in a world where survival depended on access to limited resources. Share information about dangerous areas where collectors had drowned or been killed by snakes, because the marsh was dangerous enough without adding unnecessary risks. Help newcomers avoid fatal mistakes, but don't waste time trying to save those who were clearly doomed by their own stupidity or inability to adapt to the demands of the profession. And above all, never show weakness or desperation in front of the leech merchants who bought their harvest, because any sign of desperate need would be used to drive down prices and increase exploitation. The merchants were skilled at reading the body language and behavior patterns that indicated which collectors were most vulnerable to economic pressure, and they used this knowledge to maximize their profits at the expense of people who were already operating at the margins of survival. But even Henrik, with all his experience and hard-won knowledge, was showing signs of the inevitable decline that claimed all long-term collectors, regardless of their skill or intelligence. His cough had grown worse over the years, developing from a minor irritation into a wet, rattling sound that brought up blood and pieces of tissue that suggested serious lung damage from breathing marsh vapors. His periods of delirium were becoming more frequent and lasting longer, episodes during which he would lose track of time and place while his damaged brain struggled to process reality. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Agnes could see Henrik studying his reflection in the marsh water, with the expression of a man who no longer recognized the creature staring back at him. The face that looked up from the black water was that of a stranger, hollow-eyed, gray-skinned, marked by suffering in ways that went far beyond simple physical damage. It was the face of someone who had traded away pieces of his humanity along with his blood, who had survived so much that he was no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense of the word. Agnes understood that she was seeing her own future in Henrik's deteriorating condition, and the knowledge filled her with a mixture of dread and strange acceptance. If survival in the marsh was possible at all, it required becoming something less than fully human, abandoning the emotional responses and moral considerations that made life meaningful in favor of the cold calculation required for biological survival in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. The leech trade created its own ecosystem of exploitation that extended far beyond the miserable souls who waded through marshes to harvest the creatures, creating a complex supply chain where each level extracted maximum profit from the desperation and suffering of those below. At every step from marsh to medical practice, someone was profiting from the pain of the collectors and the medical superstitions of the physicians who created the demand for bloodletting treatments. The first link in this chain of exploitation were the marsh buyers, entrepreneurial individuals who recognized that desperate collectors could be manipulated for enormous profits due to their isolation, lack of education, and pressing need for immediate cash to survive. These buyers would establish temporary camps near productive marshes during peak collecting season, offering to purchase leeches directly from collectors at prices that seemed generous compared to the effort required to transport the creatures to distant towns and cities where medical practitioners awaited their delivery. What the collectors didn't realize, because they had no access to information about market prices or the economics of the broader leech trade, was how dramatically prices increased between the marsh and the medical practitioners who used the creatures for bloodletting treatments. A collector might receive 3 pence per dozen for leeches sold to a marsh buyer, while those same leeches would sell for 2 shillings per dozen when they reached physicians in London or Paris. The markup was enormous, often representing a 700% increase in value. But the collectors were too desperate, too isolated, and too poorly educated to understand the true value of their harvest or to organize collectively to demand better prices. Master Thomas was one of these marsh buyers, a fat, prosperous-looking man who arrived at Blackmire Marsh every spring, driving a wagon loaded with supplies and cheap goods that he sold to collectors at inflated prices. He would establish a temporary camp on solid ground near the marsh edge, erecting a comfortable tent with a proper bed, table, and chairs, while the collectors slept in crude shelters they had built from salvaged materials. Thomas presented himself as a friend to the collectors, offering them fair prices for their leeches, and even extending credit during slow periods when the creatures were scarce or weather conditions made collecting impossible. But Agnes gradually learned to recognize Thomas for what he truly was, a parasite who fed on human desperation just as surely as the leeches fed on human blood, extracting profit from suffering while contributing nothing of value to the process beyond his connections to urban markets. His generous prices were a fraction of what the leeches were worth in urban markets, carefully calculated to provide collectors with just enough income to prevent them from dying of starvation, while ensuring they remained trapped in the profession. His credit came with interest rates that ensured collectors would never be able to work their way out of debt, creating a form of economic bondage that was only slightly less brutal than outright slavery. The supplies Thomas sold to collectors, bread, cheese, cheap ale, and basic necessities, were marked up to prices that consumed most of their earnings and kept them perpetually on the edge of starvation and desperation. A loaf of bread that cost 2 pence in town would cost 6 pence at Thomas's camp, justified by the convenience of not requiring collectors to make the long, dangerous journey to market. Cheese that was already moldy and barely edible would be sold at premium prices to people who had no alternatives and no ability to bargain for better terms. "Thomas gets rich while we get eaten alive," old Henrik muttered one evening, as they watched the merchant counting his profits by lamplight in his comfortable tent, the golden coins glinting in the flickering flame while the collectors huddled around their meager fires, trying to stay warm with thin blankets and inadequate shelter. "He sleeps on a feather bed while we bleed in the marsh, and somehow he's convinced us we should be grateful for the privilege of making him wealthy." But what choice did they have? Thomas offered the only ready market for their leeches within a day's walk of the marsh, and collectors who tried to transport their harvest to distant cities often found that the leeches died during the journey, or that urban merchants refused to deal with ragged, stinking marsh dwellers who showed up at their shops covered in leech bites and infection. The logistics of getting fresh, living leeches to market were complex and expensive, requiring proper containers, careful handling, and connections too. Buyers that individual collectors simply couldn't afford to develop or maintain. Above the marsh, buyers were the regional distributors, merchant houses that specialized in supplying medical leeches to physicians across wide geographic areas and had the capital and connections necessary to operate on a truly commercial scale. These distributors maintained networks of buyers who collected leeches from marshes throughout entire kingdoms, shipping the creatures in specially designed containers to medical centers where demand was highest, and prices could be maximized through careful manipulation of supply and timing. The distributors were the ones who truly understood the economics of the leech trade and possessed the market knowledge necessary to maximize profits through strategic control of supply and demand. They knew which physicians paid premium prices for the best specimens, which hospitals maintained standing orders for hundreds of leeches per month, and which medical schools needed steady supplies for teaching purposes. They could manipulate prices by controlling supply, creating artificial scarcity during peak bleeding season to drive up profits, or flooding markets with cheap specimens when competitors tried to challenge their dominance. These merchant houses also understood the seasonal nature of both leech collecting and medical demand, allowing them to coordinate supply chains across vast geographic areas to ensure steady profits throughout the year. When leeches became scarce in English marshes during winter months, they would import specimens from warmer regions of France or Spain where collecting remained viable. When demand peaked during spring bleeding season, they could draw on stockpiles accumulated during slower periods to maximize their profit margins. At the apex of this pyramid of exploitation were the physician merchants who had recognized that controlling their own leech supply offered significant advantages over purchasing from external suppliers and allowed them to integrate the profits from every level of the trade into their own operations. Some medical practitioners established their own collecting operations, sending agents to recruit collectors and establish exclusive relationships with productive marshes. Others invested in early attempts at leech farming, trying to breed the creatures in controlled environments to ensure steady supplies while avoiding the uncertainties of wild harvesting. Dr. Aldwin Breakspear was one such physician entrepreneur, a prominent medical practitioner in London who maintained exclusive contracts with collectors working marshes throughout southern England, while simultaneously operating a thriving practice that specialized in bloodletting treatments for wealthy clients. Dr. Breakspear had recognized that the leech trade offered opportunities for vertical integration that could dramatically increase profits while providing greater control over the quality and availability of the creatures his practice required. The physician paid slightly higher prices than independent buyers like Thomas, but his contracts came with strict requirements about leech quality, delivery schedules, and exclusivity arrangements that effectively made collectors into bonded laborers. Collectors who signed contracts with Dr. Breakspear agreed to sell their entire harvest exclusively to his operation, to maintain minimum monthly quotas regardless of seasonal variations or personal health problems, and to accept his agent's decisions about leech quality and pricing without appeal or negotiation. Agnes first encountered Dr. Breakspear's operation during her 5th year as a collector, when Thomas announced that he had sold his buying business to the London physician and would be moving on to establish operations in other regions where competition was less intense and profit margins could be maintained. The change meant better prices for their leeches, 4 pence per dozen instead of 3, but it also meant increased scrutiny and pressure that would ultimately prove more destructive to the collector's health and well-being than the previous arrangement. Dr. Breakspear's agents inspected every leech for size, health, and species before accepting them for purchase, rejecting specimens that failed to meet the doctor's exacting standards, and leaving collectors without buyers for leeches they had harvested at great cost to their own health. The inspection process was humiliating and arbitrary, with agents who clearly viewed the collectors as subhuman creatures whose suffering was irrelevant to the business of supplying medical leeches to paying customers. The physician also introduced quotas, minimum numbers of leeches that each collector was expected to deliver per month to maintain their relationship with his operation and continue receiving the premium prices his contracts offered. Agnes was assigned a quota of 2,000 leeches per month, which meant she needed to collect nearly 70 leeches every single day, regardless of weather conditions, her health, or seasonal variations in leech populations. Meeting these quotas required Agnes to take increasingly desperate risks that accelerated the deterioration of her health and brought her closer to the early death that awaited all long-term collectors. She began working longer hours, staying in the marsh from before dawn until after sunset in an effort to maximize her daily harvest. She ventured into deeper, more dangerous areas where larger leeches could be found, but where the risk of drowning was significantly higher. She continued working even when she was sick with fever or infection, because missing even a few days of collecting could put her dangerously behind on her monthly quota and result in the termination of her contract. The pressure was relentless and dehumanizing, treating collectors like livestock that existed solely to produce the leeches that generated enormous profits for the physician's practice. Dr. Breakspeare's agents showed no concern for the health or welfare of the collectors, beyond ensuring they remained productive enough to meet their quotas and maintain the supply chain that supported the doctor's lucrative bloodletting practice. When a collector died or became too disabled to work effectively, they were simply replaced with another desperate soul who had run out of alternatives and was willing to trade blood for survival. By her 6th year as a leech collector, Agnes had begun to understand that the marsh itself was slowly poisoning everyone who spent extended time in its waters, introducing toxins and pathogens into their bodies that caused a range of chronic health problems that worsened progressively over time. The standing water harbored dangers that went far beyond the leeches that were her primary concern. Bacterial infections, parasitic diseases, heavy metals, and toxic compounds created by decaying organic matter all combined to create an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life and incompatible with long-term survival. The most immediate dangers were the infections that inevitably developed from leech bites, even when Agnes followed all the precautions that experience had taught her. Despite allowing leeches to detach naturally, cleaning wounds as best she could with whatever clean water she could find, and watching carefully for early signs of corruption, she still developed serious infections several times per year that threatened her life and left her weakened for weeks afterward. These infections followed a predictable pattern that Agnes learned to recognize with growing dread. They began with red, streaking from the wound site, thin lines of inflammation that spread up her legs, like fingers of corruption reaching toward her heart. The streaking was followed by fever and chills that left her alternately burning with heat and shaking uncontrollably with cold. Delirium came next. Periods of confusion and hallucination that lasted for days and left her unable to distinguish between reality and the fevered productions of her damaged mind. The final stage was either gradual recovery, if her body's immune system managed to gain the upper hand over the infection, or death from sepsis, as the corruption overwhelmed her defenses entirely. Agnes learned to treat mild infections using folk remedies that sometimes worked and sometimes merely delayed the inevitable progression toward sepsis and death. She applied bread mold to infected wounds, having learned from other collectors that the fuzzy growth contained properties that helped fight corruption, a principle that would later be refined into modern antibiotic treatments, but which remained crude and unreliable in medieval practice. She chewed willow bark for fever, enduring the bitter taste because she knew it provided some relief from the worst symptoms. She drank infusions of herbs that old Henrik claimed would purify the blood, though she was never sure whether these remedies actually helped or simply gave her something to do while her body fought for survival. She prayed to every saint she could remember from her childhood, promising elaborate devotions and sacrifices if they would intercede on her behalf and spare her from the death that claimed so many of her colleagues. But as the years passed, and she witnessed the deaths of other collectors who had been equally devout in their prayers, Agnes began to suspect that divine intervention was either unavailable or uninterested in the fate of people who had been driven to such desperate circumstances. But the infections were only the most visible threat posed by prolonged exposure to the marsh environment. The water itself contained toxins that accumulated in the bodies of anyone who spent long hours immersed in it, causing a range of chronic health problems that developed gradually and worsened progressively over years of exposure. These toxins were created by anaerobic decomposition of organic matter, a process that produced sulfur compounds, methane, and other chemicals that human bodies were not equipped to process or eliminate effectively. The liver damage was among the first signs of chronic toxin exposure, causing a yellowing of the skin that made long-term collectors easy to identify, even when they were away from the marsh. Agnes first noticed the yellowing during her 4th year as a collector, a subtle change in her skin tone that gradually became more pronounced until she looked like someone suffering from jaundice. The discoloration was accompanied by chronic nausea, loss of appetite, and abdominal pain that suggested serious damage to the organ responsible for filtering toxins from her blood. Kidney problems developed around the same time, making urination painful and bloody while causing fluid retention that left her legs and feet swollen and uncomfortable. The kidney damage was particularly serious because these organs were responsible for eliminating toxins from her body, and their progressive failure meant that harmful compounds were accumulating in her tissues faster than they could be removed. Agnes learned to recognize the signs of serious kidney problems: the color and smell of her urine, the severity of the swelling in her extremities, the level of pain she experienced during urination, and to modify her work schedule when these symptoms became severe enough to threaten her immediate survival. The nervous system damage was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of chronic toxin exposure, causing a range of symptoms that affected every aspect of Agnes's daily life and mental functioning. The tremors began during her 4th year as a collector, starting as a minor shaking in her hands that she initially dismissed as a natural response to cold exposure and physical stress. But the shaking gradually worsened and spread from her hands to her arms and eventually throughout her entire body, until she moved with the perpetual palsy that marked long-term marsh workers as surely as a brand. These tremors made every aspect of daily life more difficult and dangerous. Agnes had trouble feeding herself because she couldn't hold utensils steady enough to bring food to her mouth without spilling it. She couldn't hold a cup of water without its contents sloshing everywhere, making it difficult to stay hydrated during the hot summer months when dehydration was already a serious concern. Most critically, the tremors affected her ability to collect leeches efficiently, making it harder to handle the creatures without damaging them and reducing her daily harvest, at a time when meeting her quotas was already challenging her failing health. Sleep became increasingly difficult as the toxins accumulated in her system and began affecting her brain chemistry in ways that disrupted normal rest patterns. Agnes would lie awake for hours, her body racked with muscle cramps, and her mind tormented by vivid hallucinations that seemed more real than waking life. Sometimes she would see her dead husband Walter, standing at the foot of her crude shelter, his face pale and accusing, asking why she had chosen to destroy herself instead of finding some other way to provide for their children. Other times, she would dream that she was drowning in black marsh water, while leeches covered her body like living armor, growing larger and larger until they consumed her entirely and left nothing behind but bones bleaching in the sun. The hallucinations became more frequent and more vivid as the years passed, blurring the line between reality and delusion until Agnes was never entirely sure whether what she was experiencing was actually happening or simply the product of her deteriorating mind. She would have conversations with other collectors who had been dead for years, receiving advice about leech collecting techniques from people who existed only in her damaged memory. She would see phantom leeches attached to her legs, feeling the familiar sensation of feeding even when no creatures were actually present. The mental effects were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of chronic toxin exposure, because they stripped away Agnes's sense of identity and connection to the world around her. She found herself becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotions, viewing the world with a kind of clinical detachment that disturbed even her fellow collectors. She could watch a newcomer develop serious infection without feeling anything beyond mild academic interest in whether they would recover or die. She could collect leeches from her own bleeding legs without experiencing the revulsion that had once made the task almost unbearable. This emotional numbing was accompanied by periods of inexplicable rage that could flare up without warning, filling Agnes with murderous fury toward the people who profited from her suffering. During these episodes, she would fantasize about burning down Dr. Breakspeare's practice, about drowning Thomas the marsh buyer in the contaminated water that had poisoned so many collectors, about forcing the physician to stand naked in Blackmire Marsh while leeches fed on his pampered flesh until he understood the true cost of the treatments he prescribed so casually. But the rage would pass as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only exhaustion and the grim recognition that her own death was approaching with the inexorability of winter. Agnes could see her future written in the faces of the long-term collectors who had survived longer than most. Old Henrik, with his constant cough and shaking hands, Silent Tom, whose skin had turned permanently yellow from liver damage, Widow Sarah, whose seizures were becoming more frequent and more severe as her damaged brain struggled to function despite the accumulated toxins. They were all dying by degrees, sacrificing their lives drop by drop to feed an industry that viewed them as nothing more than expendable components in a supply chain designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. And the most bitter irony was that their sacrifice was ultimately pointless. The bloodletting treatments that created demand for leeches were not only ineffective, but actively harmful to the patients who received them, weakening already sick people and often hastening their deaths rather than promoting healing. As wild leech populations began to decline due to overharvesting and environmental degradation, competition between collectors became increasingly desperate and sometimes violent, transforming what had once been a profession where workers could maintain cordial relationships despite their shared misery into a brutal struggle where survival often depended on denying others access to productive collecting areas. The marshes that had once supported dozens of collectors working in relative harmony became battlegrounds where desperate people fought for access to dwindling resources that represented the difference between survival and starvation. The decline in leech populations was the inevitable result of harvesting practices that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability, combined with environmental changes that were making traditional leech habitats less suitable for supporting large populations of the creatures. Intensive collection had stripped the most accessible areas of their leech populations, forcing collectors to venture into increasingly remote and dangerous parts of the marshes, where the risks were higher, but the potential rewards were declining, along with the overall population of harvestable creatures. Environmental factors also contributed to the decline, including changes in water quality, temperature, and seasonal patterns that affected leech breeding cycles and survival rates. The marshes themselves were slowly changing, as human activity altered drainage patterns and water flow, creating conditions that were less favorable for the aquatic ecosystems that supported leech populations. Pollution from nearby towns and agricultural activities introduced toxins into the water that killed leeches, along with other aquatic life, reducing the carrying capacity of marshes that had once been highly productive. The first sign of this changing dynamic came during Agnes's 7th year as a collector, when a group of organized newcomers arrived at Blackmire Marsh, claiming exclusive rights to the most productive areas and demanding that established collectors abandon spots they had worked for years. These newcomers were different from the usual desperate individuals who drifted into the profession. They worked in coordinated groups, used superior equipment and techniques, and employed collection methods that seemed designed to maximize short-term harvests, regardless of the long-term consequences for leech populations or the survival of other collectors. The newcomers were led by a scarred veteran named Black Peter, who claimed to have worked marshes from Scotland to Cornwall and possessed knowledge of leech behavior that surpassed even old Henrik's hard-won expertise. Peter was a large, intimidating man with arms like tree trunks and a face that bore the distinctive scars of someone who had survived more violence than most people could imagine. He had lost his left eye in some unspecified conflict, and the empty socket was covered by a leather patch that made his remaining eye seem unnaturally bright and predatory. Peter's crew consisted of perhaps a dozen men and women who followed his orders without question and seemed prepared to use violence to enforce their leader's territorial claims. They were better equipped than individual collectors, carrying nets, traps, and specialized tools that allowed them to harvest leeches more efficiently than traditional methods. They had developed techniques for keeping harvested leeches alive during transport to distant markets, giving them access to buyers who paid premium prices for fresh specimens delivered in good condition. But their most significant advantage was their willingness to use violence to control access to prime collecting areas, establishing territorial boundaries that they enforced through intimidation and physical force. When established collectors like Agnes tried to work areas that Peter's crew had claimed, they found themselves confronted by armed thugs who made it clear that trespassers would face serious physical consequences that could include permanent disability or death. The local authorities showed no interest in intervening in disputes between leech collectors, viewing them as subhuman creatures whose conflicts were beneath official attention and unworthy of legal protection. Collectors had no recourse to courts or magistrates when their traditional working areas were seized by better organized competitors, leaving them vulnerable to any group that possessed superior force and fewer moral constraints about using violence to achieve economic objectives. The situation escalated rapidly when Peter's crew began using horses and cattle as leech bait, driving the animals into the marsh and allowing hundreds of leeches to attach, before removing them and collecting the gorged creatures in massive quantities. This technique allowed them to harvest enormous numbers of leeches quickly and efficiently, but it also stripped entire areas of their leech populations within days and left nothing for individual collectors who relied on the traditional method of using their own bodies as bait. Agnes watched helplessly as productive areas that had sustained her for years were completely depleted within weeks of Peter's arrival at Blackmire Marsh. Areas where she had once been able to collect 300 or 400 leeches per day now yielded barely a dozen specimens, and even those were small, unhealthy creatures that marsh buyers rejected as unsuitable for medical use. Her income plummeted just as Dr. Breakspeare's agents were demanding that she maintain her monthly quotas or face termination of her contract and loss of access to the premium prices that made survival barely possible. The desperate competition led to the development of increasingly dangerous collection techniques, as individual collectors tried to find ways to compete with organized crews that had superior resources and fewer moral constraints. Some collectors began working at night, when Peter's group was less likely to interfere, despite the significantly increased risks of drowning or snakebite. In darkness, where visual navigation was almost impossible, others ventured into deeper parts of the marsh, where leeches were more numerous, but where the danger of falling into bog holes or becoming lost in the maze of channels was much higher than in the shallow areas where they had previously worked. Agnes herself began experimenting with using rotting animal flesh as bait, following techniques she had observed being used by French collectors who visited English marshes during peak season. She would place pieces of decaying meat in areas where leeches were known to concentrate, then return hours later to collect the creatures that had gathered to feed on the carrion. This technique was more efficient than using her own body as bait and reduced the amount of blood loss she experienced during each collecting session. But it also exposed her to additional health risks from handling putrid flesh and breathing the toxic gases it released as it decomposed. The use of rotting meat as bait created its own set of problems and dangers that Agnes had not anticipated when she first adopted the technique. The decaying flesh attracted not only leeches, but also rats, flies, and other scavengers that competed for access to the bait and made collection more difficult and dangerous. The smell was overwhelming, a stench so powerful that it could be detected from hundreds of yards away and made working in the immediate area almost unbearable. Worst of all, the rotting meat served as a breeding ground for bacteria and other pathogens that could cause serious illness through skin contact or inhalation. The most desperate collectors began using techniques that amounted to deliberate self-mutilation in their efforts to attract more leeches and compete with the organized crews that were dominating the most productive areas. Some would deliberately create open wounds on their legs before entering the marsh, using knives or broken glass to slice their skin in the belief that fresh blood would attract leeches more effectively than intact skin. Others began working completely naked, exposing their entire bodies to a leech attachment in hopes of maximizing their daily harvest and meeting the quotas that determined whether they could maintain their contracts with buyers. These extreme measures rarely improved collecting success and often resulted in life-threatening blood loss or infection that left collectors disabled or dead. Agnes witnessed several collectors collapse and drown after losing too much blood during collecting sessions where they had deliberately increased their vulnerability to leech attachment. Others developed massive infections from deliberately created wounds that became contaminated with marsh water and required amputations or resulted in death from sepsis. But desperation drove people to attempt anything that might give them a competitive advantage in the increasingly cutthroat world of leech collecting, even when rational analysis would have revealed that such techniques were more likely to hasten their deaths than improve their economic prospects. The psychology of desperation created a willingness to accept any risk if there was even a slight possibility of improving one's situation, regardless of the probability of success or the severity of the potential consequences. The violence between competing collectors reached its peak during the summer of Agnes's 8th year in the profession, when Black Peter's crew attacked a group of independent collectors who had been working a previously unclaimed area of the marsh and attempting to establish their own territorial claims. The attack was swift and brutal, with Peter's men using knives, clubs, and other weapons to drive off the independent collectors and establish their dominance over the contested area. The attack left 2 collectors dead and several others seriously injured, but local authorities dismissed the incident as a dispute between vagrant criminals that was beneath official attention and unworthy of investigation. The bodies of the dead collectors were found floating in the marsh 3 days later, their corpses bloated and partially consumed by the creatures they had spent their lives harvesting. No one was held accountable for their deaths, and their murders served as a warning to other collectors about the consequences of challenging organized groups that possessed superior force. Old Henrik was one of the injured collectors, having suffered a broken arm and several deep cuts from the knives that Peter's men used to enforce their territorial claims. The injuries left him unable to work for several weeks, and when he finally returned to collecting, his effectiveness was permanently impaired by the damage to his dominant arm and the psychological trauma of the attack. Agnes realized with growing dread that Henrik's injury marked the beginning of his final decline. Within a year, the man who had been her mentor and guide would be dead from complications related to his wounds and the accumulated damage from decades of marsh exposure. The violence and territorial disputes created an atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion that made an already difficult profession even more dangerous and psychologically destructive. Collectors could no longer work alone without fear of attack, but forming alliances for mutual protection meant sharing information about productive areas and reducing individual profits in an economy where survival already required harvesting leeches at the very limits of physical endurance. The social bonds that had once provided some comfort and support in the face of shared misery were dissolved by competition for scarce resources, and the knowledge that helping another collector survive might mean less food for one's own family. During her 9th year as a leech collector, Agnes had an encounter that crystallized her understanding of the profound hypocrisy underlying the entire bloodletting industry, and revealed the callous indifference of the medical practitioners who created demand for the leeches she harvested at such terrible cost to her own health and life. Dr. Breakspear himself arrived at Blackmire Marsh to inspect the collecting operation and ensure that his quality standards were being maintained by the contractors who managed his leech supply chain. The physician arrived in a comfortable carriage, drawn by matched horses, accompanied by servants who carried parasols to protect him from the sun and folding chairs, so he wouldn't have to sit on the ground near the contaminated marsh water. His entourage included several assistants and clerks who took notes on every aspect of the operation, recording data about leech quality, collection rates, and the health status of the collectors who provided the raw materials for his profitable medical practice. Dr. Breakspear wore expensive robes of fine wool, dyed in rich colors that probably cost more than Agnes could earn in 5 years of collecting leeches. His hands were soft and white, unmarked by any form of manual labor, and his face showed the healthy color that came from good nutrition and freedom from chronic disease. His boots were made of fine leather that had been polished to a high gloss, and his overall appearance projected wealth and social status that seemed obscene in the context of the marsh, where desperate people destroyed their health to supply his practice. The physician spent perhaps an hour at the marsh edge, observing the collectors at work from a safe distance while making notes in a leather-bound notebook journal, and discussing various aspects of the operation with his assistants. He showed no interest in the human cost of leech collecting, viewing the scarred and weakened collectors as nothing more than components in his supply chain, whose suffering was irrelevant to the business of supplying medical leeches to paying customers. Agnes was working in relatively shallow water when Dr. Breakspear arrived, standing knee-deep in the black marsh water while leeches fed on her legs and feet. She could see the physician and his entourage clearly from her position, could observe their comfortable clothing and well-fed appearance, while she endured the familiar sensations of parasites consuming her blood. The contrast between the physician's obvious prosperity and her own desperate circumstances drove home the fundamental injustice of their relationship with devastating clarity. When Thomas the marsh buyer brought Dr. Breakspear samples of the leeches that had been collected that week, the physician examined them with the same detached professional interest he might show when studying any other commodity. He held each leech up to the light, examining its size and color, testing its responsiveness to stimuli, and making notes about its suitability for medical use. The creatures that represented hours of Agnes's suffering were reduced to objects of scientific curiosity, evaluated solely on their commercial value with no consideration for the human cost of their acquisition. "These specimens are acceptable," Dr. Breakspear announced after examining a dozen leeches that represented a full day's work for Agnes and several other collectors. but I want to see larger, healthier creatures in future shipments. The medical efficacy of bloodletting depends on using only the finest leeches, and I won't compromise the health of my patients by accepting inferior specimens. The bitter irony of this statement was not lost on Agnes, who could see the physician clearly despite being partially concealed by the reeds where she was working. Here was a man who claimed to care about the health of his patients, while showing complete indifference to the people whose blood and lives he was consuming to obtain his precious leeches. He spoke of medical efficacy while relying on a supply chain that destroyed human lives as systematically as any plague or famine that had ever swept through medieval Europe. But what truly infuriated Agnes was her growing awareness of evidence that bloodletting itself was not only useless, but actively harmful to the patients who received it. She had overheard conversations between marsh buyers and regional distributors that made it clear that many physicians were beginning to question the practice, and that some medical schools were teaching that bloodletting should be used more sparingly, or abandoned altogether in favor of alternative treatments. Yet Dr. Breakspear and physicians like him continued to demand enormous quantities of leeches, not because they believed in the medical benefits of bloodletting, but because it was profitable and established practice that their patients expected when they sought medical treatment. Bloodletting was what people expected when they paid for medical care, and physicians who abandoned the practice risked losing clientele to competitors who still offered the dramatic spectacle of bleeding treatments that looked like they were actually doing something to cure disease. The economics of medical practice in medieval times created powerful incentives for physicians to continue using treatments that generated revenue, regardless of their actual effectiveness in treating disease. Bloodletting was an expensive procedure that required significant quantities of leeches, and physicians could charge premium prices for treatments that appeared dramatic and medically sophisticated. Patients who paid substantial sums for medical care expected to receive treatments that looked impressive and involved obvious intervention, not simple advice about rest and nutrition that they could have obtained from any village-wise woman. Agnes realized that she and her fellow collectors were sacrificing their lives not to advance medical knowledge or heal the sick, but to maintain the profits and professional status of physicians who were too cowardly or too greedy to acknowledge that their treatments were worthless and potentially harmful. The leeches she harvested at such terrible cost to her own health would be used to weaken patients who would recover faster and more completely if left untreated, creating suffering for both the collectors who supplied the creatures and the patients who received the bloodletting treatments. The knowledge that her suffering served no beneficial purpose beyond enriching already wealthy physicians filled Agnes with a rage that bordered on madness and threatened to overwhelm the emotional numbness that had protected her sanity during her years in the marsh. She began to fantasize about ways to disrupt Dr. Breakspear's operation, contaminating leech shipments with diseased specimens, revealing to his patients the true cost of their treatments, or simply burning down his practice and destroying his accumulated wealth. She imagined forcing the physician to stand naked in Blackmire Marsh while leeches covered his pampered body, making him experience the blood loss and weakness that collectors endure daily to supply his practice. She dreamed of dragging him through the contaminated water until he understood the infections and toxin exposure that were slowly killing everyone who worked to maintain his profitable medical practice. She fantasized about making him watch while his own children were forced to become leech collectors, trading their blood for survival while their father counted coins in his comfortable office. But these fantasies provided no real relief from the grinding reality of her situation and offered no practical solutions to the problems that trapped her. In a profession that was systematically destroying her health and shortening her life. She was caught in a system that would continue to consume her life, regardless of whether she understood its fundamental injustice or developed detailed knowledge of its harmful effects on both collectors and patients. Dr. Breakspeare's agents still demanded their monthly quotas. Her children still needed food and shelter, and the marsh still waited each morning to extract another payment of blood and suffering for the privilege of survival. Agnes's last spring as a leech collector began with the same ritual that had marked the start of every collecting season for the past decade. The walk through pre-dawn darkness to Blackmire Marsh, the careful preparation of her collection bag and willow wand, the mental steel she had to summon before stepping into water that had slowly killed everyone who spent extended time in its embrace. But this spring felt different from all the others, carrying with it an ominous weight that Agnes recognized on some instinctive level as the approach of her own ending. She could sense that her body had reached the limit of its endurance, that the accumulated damage from years of blood loss, infection, and toxin exposure had pushed her beyond the point where recovery was possible. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely grip her collection tools. Her breathing was so labored that even walking to the marsh left her gasping for air, and her periods of confusion and memory loss were becoming longer and more frequent, leaving her increasingly disconnected from the present moment and unable to distinguish between past and present, reality and hallucination. The marsh itself had changed dramatically over the decade that Agnes had worked its waters. The most productive areas had been stripped of their leech populations by aggressive collecting techniques employed by Black Peter's crew and other organized groups, forcing the remaining collectors to venture into increasingly remote and dangerous parts of the wetland, where the risks were higher, but the potential rewards continued to decline, along with the overall population of harvestable creatures. Areas that had once supported dozens of collectors now barely provided enough leeches to sustain a handful of desperate workers. The ecosystem that had supported the profession was collapsing under the pressure of overharvesting, just as Agnes's body was collapsing under the accumulated stress of her work. Black Peter's crew had moved on to other marshes months earlier, having extracted most of the easily accessible value from Blackmire, and left behind a depleted landscape that would take years to recover, if it ever could. The remaining collectors were mostly long-term veterans like Agnes, broken down individuals whose bodies were too damaged to allow them to seek other employment, and who had nowhere to go except deeper into the marsh in search of the ever-declining leech populations. Old Henrik was dead, having succumbed to the inevitable combination of infection and organ failure during the previous winter. Silent Tom had disappeared one day and was found weeks later floating face down in a remote part of the marsh, his body so decomposed that the cause of death could not be determined. One by one, Agnes's colleagues and mentors were dying or disappearing, leaving her increasingly alone in a profession that had always been solitary, but was now becoming genuinely isolated. Thomas the marsh buyer had also departed, following the organized crews to more productive locations where he could maintain his profit margins and continue exploiting desperate collectors in regions where leech populations remained viable. The local leech trade now consisted of occasional visits from regional distributors who paid rock-bottom prices for whatever specimens the remaining collectors could harvest. Agnes's income had fallen to barely a quarter of what she had earned during her peak years, despite the fact that she was taking much greater risks and working much longer hours in increasingly dangerous conditions. Dr. Breakspeare had terminated her contract months earlier, citing her failure to meet monthly quotas and the declining quality of the leeches she was able to harvest from the depleted marsh. Without access to premium prices, Agnes found herself earning barely enough to buy bread for herself, let alone support her children, who had grown old enough to fend for themselves, but still needed her income to supplement their meager wages from occasional odd jobs. The decline in earnings forced Agnes to make increasingly desperate choices that accelerated the destruction of her already failing health. She began working 7 days a week, instead of taking Sundays off for rest and recovery. She started using more dangerous collection techniques, including the practice of creating deliberate wounds to attract leeches more efficiently. And she began working alone in the most remote parts of the marsh, where the risk of drowning or becoming lost was significantly higher, but where a few productive leech colonies still survived. In areas that other collectors were too weak or too frightened to reach. It was during one of these solo expeditions that Agnes experienced what would prove to be her final collecting session. She had ventured deeper into the marsh than ever before, following rumors that Widow Sarah had found a productive area near the center of the wetland, where few collectors ever went because of the extreme dangers involved in reaching it. The journey to this rumored collecting area required walking for hours through chest-deep water, navigating around bog holes and fallen trees, while carrying her collection equipment and fighting off the constant dizziness that came from chronic blood loss and malnutrition. When she finally reached the area Sarah had described, Agnes found that the reports had been accurate. The water was thick with leeches of all sizes and species, more than she had seen in years of declining harvests. Here was a concentration of creatures that could potentially allow her to meet her survival needs for weeks, if she could harvest them successfully and transport them to buyers before they died in captivity. She waded into the deepest part of the area and began the familiar ritual of thrashing the water with her willow wand, attracting the creatures from their hiding places and allowing them to attach to her legs and feet. But something was different about this collecting session, something that should have warned her to retreat to safer conditions, but which her desperate circumstances prevented her from recognizing as dangerous. The leeches seemed more aggressive than usual, attaching in greater numbers and feeding more voraciously than Agnes had ever experienced, in a decade of allowing parasites to consume her blood. Within minutes, her legs were covered with dozens of the creatures, each one growing fat with her life force, while others continued to attach to any exposed skin they could find. The blood loss was more severe than usual, and Agnes found herself becoming dizzy and disoriented far more quickly than normal. As she tried to maintain her balance in the chest-deep water, Agnes realized that she was in serious trouble. The combination of excessive blood loss, her already weakened condition, and the remote location had created a situation where she might not survive to complete her harvest. Her vision was beginning to blur, her legs were becoming weak and unsteady, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to distinguish between the leeches that were still feeding and those that had already detached. Agnes tried to make her way back toward shallower water, but her sense of direction had become confused in her weakened state. Every direction looked the same in the gray light of the marsh, and she couldn't remember which way she had come or where the solid ground lay. The water around her was red with her own blood from dozens of leech bites, and more leeches were attracted to the blood scent and began attaching to parts of her body that she had never allowed them to reach before. The last thing Agnes remembered clearly was looking down at her reflection in the blood-tinted marsh water and seeing a face that she barely recognized as her own, hollow-eyed, pale as death, with leeches attached to her neck and arms as well as her legs. The creature staring back at her from the water looked more dead than alive, a ghost haunting the margins between life and death. Agnes felt herself falling forward, her strength finally exhausted by the massive blood loss and the accumulated damage from years of marsh exposure. The black water closed over her head, and she sank beneath the surface with dozens of leeches still attached to her body, still feeding even as she drowned in the contaminated water that had been slowly killing her for a decade. Agnes's body was never recovered from the depths of Blackmire Marsh. The remote location where she died ensured that no one would discover her remains or mark her passing with even the crude burial that other collectors had received. She simply disappeared, as so many collectors had before her, leaving behind no grave marker or permanent record of her existence beyond the scarred memories of the few colleagues who survived her. Her children learned of their mother's death weeks later, when one of the remaining collectors mentioned that Agnes had not been seen for some time and was presumed dead. Thomas and Robert, now 15 and 13 respectively, had already found work as laborers and were earning enough to survive without their mother's increasingly meager contributions. Margaret, now 11, was taken in by a neighbor woman who needed help with domestic tasks and was willing to provide food and shelter in exchange for unpaid labor. The children mourned their mother as best they could, but they had been prepared for her death by years of watching her slow decline and understanding that leech collecting was ultimately fatal for everyone who practiced it long enough. They held their own simple memorial service, sharing memories of the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep them alive, and tried to build new lives from the fragments of hope she had preserved for them through her suffering. Dr. Breakspear's practice continued to prosper, supplied with leeches from other marshes, where desperate collectors continued to trade their blood for survival. The physician never learned the names of the people who died to supply his profitable bloodletting treatments, never counted the cost in human lives of his comfortable lifestyle. He retired wealthy and respected, honored by his peers for his contributions to medical practice, and never called to account for the suffering his profession had caused. The leech trade itself began to decline within a decade of Agnes's death, as medical opinion gradually shifted away from bloodletting and toward treatments that were less dramatically harmful to patients. The marshes slowly began to recover their leech populations, but by then there were few collectors left alive to harvest them. The profession that had claimed so many lives simply faded away, leaving behind only the scarred landscapes where desperate people had once traded their life force for the coins that meant the difference between survival and starvation. Blackmire Marsh eventually returned to the wildlife that had inhabited it before humans discovered the commercial value of its leeches. The dead trees that had served as landmarks for collectors rotted away and were replaced by new growth. The channels and bog holes that had claimed so many lives filled in with sediment and vegetation. Within a generation, few people remembered that the marsh had once been the site of a thriving industry built on human desperation and suffering. But the lessons of Agnes's life and death remained relevant long after her story was forgotten. Her tragedy illustrated the brutal mathematics of survival in medieval society, where the poorest members were forced to accept work that was fundamentally incompatible with human life, because the alternatives, starvation, prostitution, abandonment of their children, seemed even worse. Her suffering revealed the callous indifference of economic systems that treated human life as expendable in pursuit of profit, creating supply chains built on desperation and maintained through exploitation. Most importantly, Agnes's story demonstrated the human cost of medical practices based on superstition rather than evidence, showing how the combination of ignorance and profit motive could create industries that destroyed lives on both sides of the transaction. The leeches she harvested, at such terrible cost to her own health, were used to weaken patients who would have recovered more quickly without treatment, creating a system of double victimization that harmed everyone except the physicians and merchants who profited from the suffering. Agnes died as she had lived her final decade, alone, forgotten by those who profited from her labor, and consumed by creatures that gave nothing back in return for what they took from her. But her story serves as a reminder that behind every historical statistic about disease, poverty, and early death were individual human beings who experienced love, hope, desperation, and pain just as intensely as anyone living today. She was one of countless thousands who lived and died in medieval Europe without leaving any record of their existence, whose names were never written in any book, and whose graves were never marked with stone. But every society is built on the foundation of such forgotten lives, and every generation owes a debt to those who suffered in obscurity to create the world we inherited. In the end, Agnes's legacy lies not in any lasting achievement or monument, but in the simple fact that she loved her children enough to sacrifice everything for their survival. That love sustained her through a decade of unimaginable suffering and motivated her to continue working even when she knew it was killing her. It was a love that transcended the brutal circumstances of her life and proved that human dignity could survive even the most dehumanizing conditions. The marsh kept its secrets, and Agnes became part of the black water that had claimed her life. But somewhere in the soil of England, enriched by the blood of countless forgotten people, new life continued to grow, a testament to the resilience of hope in even the darkest circumstances, and to the possibility that human suffering, however meaningless it may seem, contains within it the seeds of a better future for those who come after. In the silence of Blackmire Marsh, where mist still rises on summer mornings and leeches still move through the dark water, the story of Agnes and her fellow collectors remains written in the landscape itself, invisible to casual observers, but present nonetheless as a reminder of the price that was paid for the world we now inhabit, and of the responsibility we bear to ensure that such sacrifices are never again demanded of those who have no choice but to make them.